Inflation in the United States has been hitting new record highs over the last 2 years, and consumers are understandably upset about all of these price increases, especially since they're happening so suddenly. However, inflation just hit a new record, but this time it's on the business side. Wholesale prices rose by around 9.6% in November of 2021, and that is the highest year-over-year increase that we have ever seen. This new record high for wholesalers has a big impact on businesses and the amount of supply that they can hold. So today I want to talk all about what this new inflation increase means and what it's going to mean for you and for businesses. But before we get into all of that, my name is Nate from Minority Mindset News, and if you like this video, then smash that thumbs up button below and hit that notification bell too. That way YouTube shows our videos to way more money minds around the world, and we can keep making videos just like this one. If you weren't already exhausted from all of the records that inflation and pretty much everything else has been setting in our economy over the last 2 years, inflation just hit a new record high. Wholesale prices went up by around 9.6% in November. Now, this is all according to the Producer Price Index. This is a little bit different than the Consumer Price Index, which shows all of the prices for the goods and services that we purchase in our everyday lives. The Producer Price Index is more on the business side. It shows the price that all of our businesses are going to have to pay for goods and services. What's even crazier though is according to the numbers, the estimates that Wall Street had was around 9.2%. So they definitely expected the Producer Price Index to go up in November of 2021. However, things went up even faster than they had expected. And I think that there is a couple different reasons for this. For one, our supply chain in the United States has been on edge for the past 2 years. Because everything is in short supply right now, that is making consumers have to pay even more. Consumers right now have a high demand for everything due to a few different factors like unemployment being so low and wages starting to rise throughout the entire country. Now, when wages start to rise and unemployment starts to go down, things are going to lag as far as when people are buying things. And these indexes that come out are going to be a little bit behind on how purchasing is being done in our economy. But with everybody purchasing everything at such a high demand, you have producers not able to keep up with all of that demand. That means our supply is starting to go down, and businesses are going to have to pay a lot more in order to get that same supply or even more supply. Number two, the actual resources for just about everything are also in short supply. Crude oil, gasoline, and a lot of our other energy resources are being used and reallocated towards a lot of things in our society. Back when the pandemic was first beginning, back in March of 2020, a lot of people were home, and that meant that people couldn't go out and make things at their jobs, but also people were spending a lot more time at home using a lot more energy. Gas prices eventually dipped, but now they are hitting record highs again. And what a lot of people don't know is that crude oil is used to make a ton of different things in our society. And with those prices starting to go up, the production is costing businesses more. In addition, I mentioned before about wages going up. Now that can lead to the Consumer Price Index, which we'll talk about in a second, showing that prices are rising throughout the country. But this is also a big factor for businesses as well. As wages start to increase throughout the United States, that means your production costs are starting to go up. I mean, literally, the people that are producing your goods and services is starting to go up. That is a big cost for companies. And right now we are facing a labor shortage throughout the United States, which means that the amount of workers that companies have is going down. And when that happens, it's harder to produce a lot more goods, leading to higher inflation in both the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index. And let's talk about the Consumer Price Index here, because the most recent Consumer Price Index was released in December of 2021. And it essentially showed that inflation was rising at a faster rate than we have seen in about 40 years. The price of everything in every industry throughout the United States is going up, and it went up by around 6.8%. Not only is that more than what was anticipated, it's showing a month-by-month increase of just about everything. And this is a very complicated issue, but there is a reason why inflation is rising so fast right now. Part of the reason for that is because of the pandemic. The pandemic has changed a lot of things about our lives. It's changed how we interact with other people, it's changed how we travel, and it's changed how our economy works. One of those biggest changes is inflation. Now, inflation typically happens at a rate of 2 to 3% every single year. This is what is considered healthy by the Federal Reserve. And we'll get into the Federal Reserve and what healthy means in just a few. But inflation typically goes up every single year, and that can show a growing economy. But when inflation goes up too fast, that means that the prices are getting out of control throughout your country. And over the last 2 years, prices have gone up a lot. The pandemic has caused that because of supply chain issues. When everything shut down in March and April of 2020, everything pretty much got backlogged and people couldn't go out and buy things because producers weren't making as much. And nobody had the same level of income like they did before because unemployment was skyrocketing too. Unemployment reached new record highs that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Enter the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve essentially creates the monetary policy in the United States and tells the Treasury Department how much money that the United States needs to print. They also keep an eye on how much money is in circulation so that we can avoid things like hyperinflation. So basically, it's their job to monitor inflation and make sure that our monetary supply isn't getting too out of control. And the federal government and the Federal Reserve decided to print around $3 to $5 trillion in 2020 and in parts of 2021 in order to lift the United States out of financial disaster caused by the pandemic. All of this money was essentially trickled down to the people in one way or another. You had the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave businesses additional funds just to not fire employees. That goes back to the people. And then you also had direct stimulus checks. People were getting thousands of dollars and they could spend it however they liked. And you also had extended unemployment benefits, which gave people federal money on top of their state benefits. So people were getting a ton of money and they were going out and buying a lot more things. This meant that there is more money circulating throughout our economy, which creates inflation. The reason it creates inflation is because there is only so much that can be produced. And that is exactly what happened with the producer price index. Producers can only make so much at one time, and if they can't make a lot, companies and businesses are going to have to pay more, which is what happens to you at the grocery store, or any store for that matter. If you go out and you try to buy something, they either have it or they are out of stock. And Americans were running into a problem where there was only a limited amount of some items on shelves. Because there was such a limited supply and such a high demand, that created an inflation in the prices. Companies can't just produce more for free. Because of that, prices have to go up for them too. And the producer price index directly influences what the consumer price index will be, because depending on what companies are paying in production costs and actually making a lot of their items, that will show consumers and the Labor Department how much prices are going to go up month after month. It's sort of like the first sign of inflation throughout the country. If companies have to start paying more in order to make things, they're going to have to get a lot more money. And in order to get more revenue and profits, that has to be trickled down to the consumer. You ultimately have to pay more for just about everything, and same with businesses, even though the actual items or services haven't really changed much. This is one of the biggest symptoms of inflation because the buying power of your money slowly starts to decrease as more people have money and as more money is printed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is in charge of how much money is printed in the United States. Then they give that information to the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department actually prints all of the dollars that we use every single day. The more money that is printed and the more money that is circulated throughout our society, the less each dollar is actually worth. Think of it this way. If the United States has around $100 in total, and you have $1 of all of that wealth, that means that you hold 1% of all of the money available. Now, if prices and everything else stay exactly the same, then inflation basically is non-existent. However, in order to grow, you need more money. If everything that you have right now only is costing everyone $100, you want to actually grow and build your economy, and you're going to have to print more money. So in this case, the Federal Reserve will create about $100 more. And this is fine in a vacuum. You now hold less money than you did before. Even though you're still holding $1, that $1 won't buy you all of the same things. There's more money now. There's more money in circulation. You now hold around 0.5% of all of the wealth because there's $200 in circulation. But like I said, the reason that all of this money is being printed is in order to grow and stabilize our economy. That is exactly what the Federal Reserve did in 2020. They printed all of this money so that the United States could get out of this recession and that people would start spending and they would start investing all of that money. It ultimately led to one of the shortest recessions that the United States has ever seen. But it also led to record high inflation because so many people had so much money. Even though a lot of people weren't working for months in 2020 and in 2021, there was still a ton of money going around because of economic stimulus. And according to the Producer Price Index, demand is also starting to go up throughout the United States. Energy demand went up by around 2.6%, and transportation and food also went up by 1.2%. These demand numbers are a little bit difficult to look at right now because it is the holidays in the United States, and this is typically a time when people spend more than they usually do. So it's not really hard to see why demand is starting to spike throughout the United States right now. But how long is this really going to continue for? Well, part of the reason why demand has been so high is because of all of the economic stimulus and because people are starting to get jobs again. That wasn't happening in 2020, so if you compare that to 2020 numbers, of course you're going to see a rise. In addition, there's just a lag in general from companies. We didn't really know how long the pandemic was going to last for, so some companies were being forced to produce less. And even when they could produce more, they weren't able to really catch up to what they thought demand was going to be. Companies started to slow down production because they thought people weren't going to buy as many things during the pandemic. And in a lot of cases, they were right. Brick and mortar locations really went down because people weren't going to stores, or the stores were just closed so they couldn't go shop. On the flip side though, online spending has started to boom. We saw some of the biggest online spending days in November of 2021. Cyber Monday was the second largest online spending day in history. Around $13 billion were spent on that day alone, which means consumers are ready to spend, but there's just not a lot of products for them to buy. And all of that really puts producers in a tough situation because they're trying to figure out when demand will drop and how long it will continue to stay high for. This is a big cost because companies don't want to overproduce on some goods and then just waste millions of dollars. That is one thing that experts believe will become a problem in 2022. Overproduction. All of this overproduction on goods may lead to a bigger spike in the consumer price index and inflation for the average everyday American. Companies are eventually going to hire more staff and open more factories and get their shipments to go even faster. When they do this, they will start to bring more items to the shelves, but the United States may soon drop in demand because there's just not as much money to go around. A lot of this economic stimulus is starting to end throughout the country. You have stimulus checks that have basically been cut off, and you have a lot of the extra unemployment assistance going away too. In addition, all of the programs like the mortgage moratorium and the federal student loan pause are starting to end too. So people are going to have to spend a lot more money, which means they won't have as much money to spend on goods and services, which will naturally bring down demand. But you also have wages starting to go up throughout the United States, which means in the short term, people can buy more. Prices will typically lag behind what wages are because people are getting paid right now, but production has already been made for a lot of the items in our stores. Think about it. The items that you buy at the store have already been bought and shipped to that location. They are ready to buy. However, as people buy more things, companies will eventually have to rework their production process. So that's going to kind of create a lag in our system. But like I said, if companies begin to overproduce things, that means they're going to have millions of dollars that is basically wasted. I mean, some companies will be able to get away with this. Some companies like electronic companies or tech companies can create a batch of goods and that doesn't really have an expiration date. However, there are other companies that especially work in the food business that are going to lose millions of dollars. If part of your production is making potato chips and you put 100 potato chips on the shelves, but you only end up selling 40 of them, and then the store has to throw away the rest of them, eventually the store is going to order less potato chips, and that means lower profits for the company. All of that makes a difference because if companies start getting a lot less money and there is no economic stimulus in order to protect them, companies are going to have to start making cuts. We've seen unemployment drop to around 4.2%, but that could go up if a lot of companies start dropping profits. They simply won't have enough money to pay for all of the additional employees that they've hired. And again, with employment starting to go back up, that will eventually drop inflation too, because producers won't have to make as much because people can't buy as much. However, right now they're not able to make as much because of the Great Resignation and our labor shortage. The Great Resignation is basically due to the fact that people are sick of their jobs and they want to find a new career, something that pays them a lot more, because a lot of people aren't keeping up with inflation. Sure, they might make 2 to 3% more at their job every single year, but inflation for November of 2021 was at 6.8%. That 3% raise is not really going to do you much good. And we don't really know when inflation is going to go back down. It could continue to rise into 2022, or it could get to a healthy level like the Federal Reserve believes. That is around 2 to 3%. And if it does that, companies are going to be in big trouble. They're going to have to continue to produce more because wages already went up. If you told somebody you are getting a 3% raise, you have to follow through on that. And if you don't, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So with wages going up and then inflation starting to go down, people have a lot more money. That ultimately means they can buy more things. So companies are going to have to be very careful with exactly how much they produce, and all of that is going to depend on what demand looks like over the next few months. All of this inflation has happened during a time when the Federal Reserve has said inflation is simply just transitory. Transitory meaning that it is temporary and that it will soon begin to fade away on its own. However, Chairman of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Janet Yellen, met before Congress in November of 2021 to talk about inflation and what is going to happen with their monetary policy. They basically said that they need to retire the phrase transitory because this level of inflation may not be transitory anymore. That is a big move, and it could mean that they pull back a lot of their monetary policies, which in turn would mean that people have a lot less access to money. And with a lot less access to money in the United States, people will naturally begin to spend more. However, they don't want to do this at a time when demand is also starting to drop, because that means businesses are going to get a lot less money, and that could trigger a lot of other factors like a stock market dip and businesses beginning to crash. Unemployment could begin to go up too, and right now 4% is pretty healthy when considering we had around 15% unemployment in 2020. So it's kind of like a snowball effect. If they do one thing, this is going to happen. If they do another thing, something else is going to happen. There are a lot of consequences here, and we don't really know what is going to happen with this meeting. Now, their next meeting is scheduled in mid-December, and we'll just have to wait and see exactly what they do. But the facts are pretty clear that inflation is rising on both ends. We have inflation rising for producers and companies. We also have inflation rising for consumers and everyday regular Americans. That is very frustrating to Americans who aren't making a lot more money as things continue to go up. Wages need to increase throughout society as prices go up too. And a lot of Americans are in heavy debt, but a lot of that debt was paused in 2020 and 2021. So we haven't really felt all of the effects of inflation at this point. Most of our inflation is due to our supply chain issues. This is what President Joe Biden, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Jerome Powell, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen have been saying over the last year and a half. But once things get back to normal, prices are still going to be what they were. I mean, prices typically don't go down forever. They don't fluctuate in that way. Prices will go up slightly, and then they will continue to go up slightly year after year or quarter after quarter. Americans are going to have to continue to make more, which means production costs are also going to have to go up. It's a slippery slope for the Federal Reserve and the rest of our country, but the bottom line here is that inflation has to be dealt with in one way or another. But if nothing is ultimately done, then we could reach a period called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when everything throughout the economy is starting to go up by 50% or more in price every single year. That is a massive increase, and wages and the amount of money that you have in the economy also has to go up too. Basically, your money will become completely worthless. Now, to be clear, we are definitely not in a period of hyperinflation throughout the United States. And in 2022, we probably won't be in a period of hyperinflation too. Most experts believe that we're actually in a period called stagflation. Stagflation is when inflation begins to rise, but your economic output starts to decrease. Our economic output is measured in GDP. That number will continue to shrink if profits are being taken away by inflation, and that's not really good for anyone in our capital society. Like I said though, something's got to give here, and there's consequences for actions on both sides for the federal government and the Federal Reserve, but at the end of the day, nobody wants to be caught holding the inflation bag. So somebody's going to have to pay for all of this inflation. We just haven't figured out who yet. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about the producer price index going up throughout the United States? Will we continue to see production costs rise in 2022, or will things start to drop down by the end of next year? In addition, what do you think about inflation in general? Are we going to continue to see record high inflation in 2022, or will things start to go down in 2022 and inflation will basically disappear from a lot of our radars? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. Keep hustling, money minds, and I'll see you all in the next one.